Today, we're looking at the world in a new light. And with our different perspectives, we can accelerate opportunities to create value that lasts. How will you take advantage of the connections you make this week? How will you see connectivity unleashed? As the boundaries blur between online and real life, we continue to rely on digital innovation and connectivity to transform our world. From the metaverse and NFTs to connected devices and IoT, this year's MWC themes will spark bold new ideas to create a positive future. As an industry, we pave the way for transformation and find new ways to help other industries innovate. And now, together, we continue our exciting 5G journey, delivering on our industry's commitments to tackle the mobile internet usage gap and reducing our industry's carbon footprint, creating a better future for all. Because together, we will unlock the full power of connectivity so that people, industry, and society thrive. This week, in our iconic host city, we will put our convictions to work. For our businesses, for our next generation of leaders, and for the world. Are you ready? It's time.
Welcome, partners, colleagues, and friends. My name is Kimberly Brown, and I lead GSMA's Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation program. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this session today in Kigali. Today, we are going to launch exciting new research that focuses on the digital worlds of displacement-affected communities. And we are going to discuss how our partners globally invest in research and innovation. The global humanitarian challenge is vast. There are over 300 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. These are communities that are affected by natural hazard disasters, climate shocks, conflict, and displacement. And close to 90 million of these 300 million are displaced from their homes, many who are crossing borders, becoming refugees. Mobile technology is a lifeline for people who are affected by crisis. Communities continue to prioritize mobile technology, not only as a means to communicate, to seek information and protection, but also as a tool to access humanitarian assistance. Connectivity is crucial in times of crisis for affected communities, but also for humanitarian responders. With the support of the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, GSMA has actually been responding to the global humanitarian challenge for 10 years. This is possible with the dedication of our GSMA members, from our humanitarian partners around the world, and those who are committed to accelerating the delivery and impact of digital humanitarian assistance. Over this decade, we've actually reached now 10 million people who are experiencing impact of war, disasters, food insecurity, and displacement. So we do this in a number of ways of how we reach people. We invest in innovation through a global innovation fund. We catalyze and convene partnerships between our GSMA members and our humanitarian partners to deliver digital humanitarian programming. We advocate for conducive policy environments, and we also build a research agenda to inform the future of digital humanitarian response. And we evaluate what works and the opportunities and the challenges that we face, and we communicate this to our global network and to our partners. Mobile phones are changing the way that displaced people and the communities that host them interact with the world. We all know that this pace of change was massively catalyzed and accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, when people and service providers around the world turned to digital solutions to meet basic needs during worldwide lockdowns and restrictions on movement. For a person who's displaced from their home, a mobile phone allows them to access humanitarian assistance, to speak with loved ones, to send and receive money, but also simply to relax while listening to music or watching a movie. But to ensure that mobile technology really delivers for people who are affected by crisis, it's really important that we understand how they use and how they relate with digital technology. And it's for this reason, with the support of the UK government, in partnership with UNHCR and the research people, that we carried out a large mixed methods study focusing on northern Lebanon, in Illawarra in Papua New Guinea, and in Bor, South Sudan, to provide a more holistic understanding of how displacement-affected communities in these three settings are using their mobile phones. For humanitarian organizations, recognizing the importance of technology is absolutely no longer optional. The near ubiquity of mobile around the world means that with or without the intervention of humanitarian agencies, people in humanitarian contexts are and will be using their mobile phones. And it's in the interest of humanitarians to actually really understand how people are using their phones and the local implications of connectivity. So today we are launching new research with you as our first audience to hear specifically from those who have been involved in this project and from a GSMA member who will reflect on the themes in the report. Looking forward at the GSMA, we're delighted to be able to continue our humanitarian work. At MWC in Barcelona earlier this year, UK Minister Vicky Ford announced a further £15.5 million of partnership for the GSMA to continue our humanitarian work. The GSMA, through its members and with our humanitarian partners, we feel are uniquely positioned to deliver for people who are affected by humanitarian crises, and now at an even larger scale, paving the way for a safe, inclusive, and dignified humanitarian future. We will continue to invest in humanitarian innovation at the GSMA through convening our partners, delivering research, and also building enabling policy environments. Under our renewed partnership with the UK, we will also be in a position to launch more rounds of innovation funds on humanitarian issues. So please do stay tuned to our social media channels in the coming months for some exciting announcements. We will soon welcome our panelists on stage, but first we'd like to show you a video that introduces the Digital Worlds research that's launching today. Thank you.
Mobile phones have changed the way people from displacement-affected communities interact with the world, as they have for users everywhere. In fact, phones allow people to create their own personal digital worlds. GSMA's Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation team wanted to understand more about these digital worlds, or how people in humanitarian crises use their phones. New research entitled The Digital Worlds of Displacement-Affected Communities looks at this question in 3 humanitarian contexts. Tripoli and Akkar in northern Lebanon are underdeveloped and economically fragile. It is estimated that 1/4 of the residents are refugees, mostly from Syria. To stay in touch with friends and family or access critical services and information, a mobile phone is often an early investment a Syrian refugee makes after arriving in Lebanon. Yet, the mobile penetration rate in the country is only 65% and 45% for mobile internet penetration. This is due to regular electricity outages and a declining economic situation. 41% of Syrian and 24% of Lebanese survey respondents would like to use the internet more than they currently do. Syrian refugees struggle to build trust in virtual environments. Whilst many are keen to use the internet, concerns around potential risks prevail, meaning that many have curtailed the boundaries of their own digital worlds and maintained small online footprints. Iowara is a refugee settlement of 10 villages where refugees from West Papua, Indonesia reside, alongside a small host community. The region is remote and hard to access. Phone use is relatively intermittent and mostly limited to basic calls and SMS messaging to keep in touch with family and friends. 94% of respondents reported using their phone this way. However, a small group of individuals with higher educational or financial resources sometimes serve as digital connectors. People rely on them and their phones for more advanced functions, like paying for school fees. While the vast majority of refugees in Iowara engage in some form of farming and expressed grave concerns about climate change, 83% have not used their phone to access information on climate-resilient farming techniques, likely due to low levels of digital literacy. Similar to the Lebanese context, a significant proportion of the refugee community in Iowara has concerns about the risks of phone use, including exposure to scams and misinformation. The Protection of Civilians camp in Bor, in South Sudan, offers refuge to internally displaced people. Together with the local population, the residents of the Bor camp show a mobile phone penetration rate that is 22% higher than the national market rate. Similar to Iowara and northern Lebanon, a key use of mobile phones for displaced people in Bor is to stay connected to family and friends, followed by leisure and entertainment. Entertainment, often accessed offline, offers a much-needed escape from the realities of daily life, as well as relaxation, motivation, and learning opportunities. Misinformation, especially about the political situation that circulates through social media, is a key concern. The findings across these three contexts offer learnings for the broader digital humanitarian ecosystem. Mobile technology connects displaced communities to a wider digital world. Humanitarians need to understand these worlds to ensure programs are catered to user needs, preferences, and capabilities, as well as to help users connect safely and autonomously. To learn more about the research and recommendations, you can access the full report on our website.
So as the video said, you can access that on our website from this afternoon, the video, the report, and a lot of other materials. But I'm really delighted to welcome our three panelists to the stage. Sali from the research people, John from UNHCR, and Hiba from Sudatel. Please join me. So welcome, and thanks very much for joining us. I'm first going to ask each of you to maybe introduce yourselves to our audience today and talk a little bit about your work or how it relates to the topic we're focusing on today. So Hiba, why don't I go to you first?
Hi there. Thank you, Kimberly, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone. My name is Hiba Osmani. I'm the CMO of Sudatel. And our work in Sudan involves an ICT provider. So we basically provide services and products to mobile and fixed. And we also look after the brand, and we look into the perception of our services among consumers. And I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Welcome. Thanks, Hiba. John?
Thanks, Kimberly. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Warnes, working for UNHCR's Innovation Service, and I'm leading on our digital inclusion program. The program that we operate, generously supported by the government of Luxembourg, looks to explore and innovate in how we can improve the digital inclusion of forcibly displaced people around the world. And it's obvious, for this obvious reason, why we've been working with GSMA for a number of years on these issues, and we're really happy to have been part of this new piece of research. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thanks, John. Sally, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. It has been very nice, thank you, to be here. And I would like first to shout out to my colleagues, Linda and Masharan, who led the data collection in Bor, South Sudan. They're here, and I would like to invite the audience to reach out to them also. I work for the research people, and we were very happy to contribute to the study, leading the data collection and the analysis across the three contexts. The research people were an organization that works on strengthening innovation and locally led humanitarian action, and to understand to help local actors to understand their progress, their impact, and how they can provide humanitarian assistance better.
Great, thank you. And Sally, I might actually go back over to you first, if you don't mind. So you project-led this research, Digital Worlds, that we're launching today. So it would be great, and we did this in partnership, of course, with the GSMA and with UNHCR and your organization, the research people. So it would be great if you could give an overview of the research to the audience and tell them what it's all about. Thanks.
Thank you, Kimberly. So first, I would like to acknowledge the exceptional efforts that done by our research associates across the three countries that we contributed to, and also the advisory group panel, who largely contributed to how to see these questions, how we ensure that our questions and our approach are tailored and contextualized to each of the countries that we're working on. So we would ask valid questions for the communities, but also sensitive in many aspects. As we may know that after the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been connectivity was a lifeline for many people, particularly those affected by displacement and in humanitarian action. So they were keen to be connected more to services, particularly those who stopped these services that stopped in person. So many were relying more on their mobile phones to know what services are still available, what are the solutions to these services, how can they be in touch with their beloved ones. So going forward, we wanted really to understand how the post-pandemic world operated, and it was really important to examine and unpack a little bit the current trends in how the displaced communities use and share and interact with their mobile phones in their day-to-day life. So we wanted not only to understand their use and share, but we also wanted to expand a little bit more towards 5 thematic areas, which our study goes into. We selected the 3 countries for this study. We work in South Sudan, of course, Papua New Guinea, and Lebanon, as the video was highlighting. And these countries reflect a multiple and diverse set of countries where they have different levels of coverage and different trends of humanitarian action and different connectivity and the connectivity gap as well among the communities. So they will give us a little bit of diverse snapshot how the different digital realities are in each of the countries. So the study aimed basically to provide an understanding of the impact of mobile technologies on the life of displaced communities, but also go a little bit deeper to understand how the work in these areas and thematic areas, including digital leisure that John will expand on shortly, but also financial well-being, COVID-19 and all the information about COVID-19, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and finally climate resilience. And I'm really happy to see a lot of climate resilience sessions in this forum as well. We were very lucky and very happy to work and to experiment with many methods in the way we implemented this study. For example, we used a lot of participatory methods that enabled the communities to share their perspective. For example, we used digital diaries where we can track and see how the communities use their mobile phones day by day, and how they use it in the morning and the evening, and by examining these participatory methods, we managed to understand the barriers from their user perspective. That's the name, the user perspective. Yeah, I think I'll stop here.
Great, thank you. And So we partnered, of course, with the research people and with UNHCR, and it's not the first time that we have done this type of research, John, with UNHCR. So maybe if you could share a bit of why you think it's important to dive into these issues, to invest in this type of research, and why do you think actors in the digital humanitarian sector, what they'll gain from this research?
Thanks, Kimberly, and absolutely, it's super important to invest in this, and I think any efforts, to further this are really welcome. As you mentioned in your opening remarks, and as Sali also mentioned, COVID-19 was something of a penny drop moment for many actors in the humanitarian sector, whereas before they maybe had some sort of sideline peripheral initiatives. It really required that transformation that maybe wasn't there 5 to 10 years ago. We started to see sort of fragments of it with the Mediterranean situation, but really that became square and center. And if I'm, quite honestly speaking, many organizations were playing catch up. Now, when you're sort of trying to catch up and trying to transform your systems and support through digital services and so on quickly, then you run the risk of maybe, losing people, leaving people behind. There's that old Silicon Valley adage, move fast and break things. When we're working with vulnerable, marginalized communities, we can't break things. We actually need to be responsible in how we deliver these programs and how we work with these communities. And as such, we have a do no harm mandate. We need to really take into account. And how do we do that? Well, we need to understand. And it's through research like this that we can really build out a more nuanced sort of overview of what the population's needs are, regardless of age, gender, or diversity, and that can in turn inform our programming and those working in support of these communities around the world.
Thanks, John. And I think maybe I'll ask you and Sali a couple more questions, and then I'd like, after that, to go over to Hiba for some of her reflections. So Sali, maybe if you could just briefly tell us, we've called this report Digital Worlds. What do we mean by digital worlds?
Thank you, Kimberly. The digital worlds refers to the space where the displaced communities have when they connect to their mobile phones, when they connect to the internet, and how they express and navigate this digital space. So as the video we saw earlier highlighted that Bor, where we implemented the study in South Sudan, is a very small area where have been the periphery of receiving multiple displaced communities since 2013. And as such, the displaced communities in this area were very vulnerable, and we wanted to understand how, for a vulnerable community, particularly economically vulnerable, they can use their mobile phones and how they use it and how they mobilize the very limited resources that they have in a way that they use the maximum benefit out of their using their mobile phones. So in general, South Sudan has one of the lowest rates of mobile access and connectivity in the world, but we were very surprised to see that despite this, in Bor itself, the Bor County has the strongest coverage network, and also the Bor residents, including the displaced community and the host community, were likely to have more access to mobile phones, and that was quite interesting to see that. And that highlights how far the mobile phones, accessing mobile phones and connectivity is central to the lives of the displaced communities. That was a little bit different in other contexts where we conducted the study. For example, the situation in Lebanon was totally different. We saw that there is high mobile ownership among both displaced communities and also the Lebanese host community. There's also higher connectivity rate despite the recent challenges in electricity and connection. The mobile ownership and mobile access rate were above 90% among the Syrian refugees and the Lebanese host community, so that was a little different. And that's why I think it's really interesting to kind of reflect on these different realities. We believe that also the situation in Iwara in Papua New Guinea is quite different because it's very rural, as the video showed shortly. It has very sporadic communities, and connection is also very sporadic. And the way the community access network coverage and have challenges in accessing network coverage also impacted how they exist in the digital space and the digital world as well.
Thank you. And of course, the research focuses on three contexts, as we've been mentioning. Of course, we're at MWC Africa, and so the situation in context of South Sudan, very important. Is there anything you'd like to briefly add on that before I pass over to John?
Yes, indeed. I think we had a lot of very interesting findings regarding how the communities use used their mobile phones. So for example, as we mentioned that how the social structure of the displaced communities in Bor and their very strong relations to the diaspora and their families abroad contributed to how important mobile phones were perceived to them. So that was a very strong motive for many of the internally displaced communities in Bor and to have mobile phones and to have internet connection as well. So the motives behind that was quite interesting to understand, and they were quite different because diaspora linkage and connection emerged the strongest in South Sudan rather than in Lebanon and Papua New Guinea. When we asked questions about how the communities used mobile phones, we were surprised that the use of smartphones were relatively higher in South Sudan, where 31% in both the Bor city, as Bor town and the POC camp, were 31%, which is quite high compared to other contexts as well. We also tried to understand the digital world, and that was characterized by high level of connectivity, as I mentioned, driven by multiple things between people, not only in South Sudan, but also with their colleagues and their families and family members outside South Sudan and in the region and internationally as well. These were really clear drivers, not only for staying in touch, but also for seeking other services, as we will see shortly in the section when we talk about the financial and mobile money as well. One of the most surprising things to us was the phone ownership was relatively even among men and women in South Sudan, which particularly in Bor, among all the age categories, which is something kind of challenges our assumption when you think the hypothesis was like they might have more gender skewed ownership. But this was not the case, so we were very happy to see that this percentage was quite almost even in South Sudan, which is not the case, for example, in Lebanon, when we found a little bit of gender disparity among men and women phone ownership, particularly among the use of smartphones. As this phone, this mobile ownership gap is quite small, but the access to internet was much higher gap. So men had much higher access to internet than women. So maybe this is an area of work that we want to focus on. Maybe for the sake of time, I'll stop here.
Yeah, we'll have, I'm glad we have some time to, like you said, go into some of the themes as well. So John, a couple of questions for you, and then we'll ask Hiba for her reflections. Was there anything that interested you in particular about how people were or maybe weren't using their mobile phones in the research?
Yeah, I think when we had this question originally formed, it said surprising. And, you know, there were some surprising facts in there. I think certain things stuck out at me, and you know, the word I'll use is sort of diversity, and what I mean by that is, it kind of leans into what Sali was saying, was around the real diversity of use cases that people had across the different contexts in terms of how they were using a mobile. You know, we've come a long way from where it was traditional calls and texts from a mobile device to a whole variety of use cases, mobile internet, third-party services, listening to music, sharing files between devices, all of these alternate use cases. One of the things that really struck out at me was for how many people this was like an important, you know, in South Sudan in particular, that it was an important light source. Over 75% of people said their mobile phone was important because it was a flashlight, that they could actually use it to light their way. And that really sort of sat with me as being really important. There are some things that were reaffirmed by the research. I think the importance of sort of taking an intersection approach, the differences that exist between genders, different diversities, people with disabilities, but also there were within that some really interesting facts. You know, one of the findings from South Sudan was that, you know, the ratio of people with disabilities, 24% wanted to use the internet more than they were currently doing so, compared with 12% of those who didn't have disabilities in that survey group, just showing how much motivation there is amongst these communities and how much potential there really is in furthering out sort of digital technology access for these populations.
And what would you say are some of the findings from your perspective that you think are important for humanitarian agencies, responders, and mobile network operators as well?
Yeah, for humanitarians and responders, I think that this diversity of use cases signifies like the need to shift the way that we program. And often the way that in the humanitarian sector we program is sort of by sector. You'll have somebody working on cash intervention, somebody working on access to information. But with such a diverse number of use cases, actually the way that mobile exists within people's lives and digital technology more generally is that it permeates so many different facets that we really need to have a more integrated approach to the humanitarian programming that we're undertaking to join up these dots and make that make more sense collectively. For mobile network operators, I think, what I was saying about that motivation is really important. We know that there are some slight slowdowns in mobile penetration subscriber growth, but when you see the fact that these people are maybe not connected but really want to be using more mobile internet, in terms of the long-term prospects of their businesses, that's really exciting. I think for maybe two reasons as well. One is you have the international aid development finance that can support and through collaboration build out advanced activities that aren't just CSR opportunities, but actually are linked with their standard business case, but also with those motivations that exist in people to think in the longer term, 5 years time or so, they are going to be the next customers, and how can we accelerate that cycle so that we bring people into the digital and mobile ecosystem quicker. So I think there's plenty to take away. That's just a snapshot, given the time we have.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. And so, Hiba, if we can turn over to you now, from the M&O perspective, how do you engage with humanitarian organizations? Does Sudatel have a strategy for engaging or working on humanitarian issues?
Sudatel was the first mobile operator in Sudan, and that gives it privilege. With 15,000 kilometers in fiber, where you get to connect the whole country. And having a data center that enables most of the future digital services to come in place. Building an academy to nourish the youth program in terms of getting certifications on the telecommunication aspect. We also, a huge pillar for the e-government establishment on many of the verticals. And lastly, we have founded one of the biggest hub for financial institute in Sudan, which called EBS, to enable the banking sector. That's all being said. If we don't have the infrastructure and we don't have the backbone, reaching and connecting will be a challenge. For humanitarian, this is a must. And if we basically look into our brand equity, for example, one of the most pillars that contribute to the brand perception of the consumer is contributing to the society. We have been rewarded in September this year with from the International Congress of Social Responsibility. And that shows that we're quite serious in taking act into the society. The way we formulate the stuff, we basically have our dedicated budget yearly that is being given to either governmental projects or non-governmental. And we have a created department from different sections, and they basically come and plan. In terms of a need arises, we come up with the plan accordingly. We take social responsibility very seriously, and we have like a whole dedicated department for that. That's how we integrate in terms of humanitarian.
And how would you take these type of consumer insights into account, and how does that then relay into your humanitarian objectives or KPIs?
I would like to give you an example. Regarding, we had a disruption in the neighborhood country, Ethiopia, that happened last year. And that created a displaced community in Sudan. The minute we heard about it, we basically arose and we basically created a committee. We took one of the cows, which is like a mobile site for network. We took one of the cows and we basically displayed it in there. And it was enabled with 3G technology, and it was powered with the solar, just to ensure that there will be continuity in there. And when we actually went there, we had a pre-plan because we knew that they're coming from Ethiopia, due to the disruption that was happening, then we thought, why don't we give them a different specified tariff to call between them as a discounted rate, and let's enable them to call back home at a very good international rate as well based on their consumption. So we had that in mind, and we preloaded the SIM cards, and we basically took the chance and went there. After a year, we realized that their contribution to data was very little in the beginning. It was only 46% from the total, and they're standing now at 65% from the total. And that made us think, wow, we went to the voice aspect, looking into the insight, and we basically preloaded everything, and then it came out, and it goes with the research that the digital is becoming a need, and it's becoming a behavior that makes people well-being in the displaced area. And it shows with the data as well. And from an operator point of view, when we did that, the call was more humanitarian, but we did actually got some profit from it. The actual revenue from that specific site has increased by 154% on a year. And when we look into the amount, the monthly amount that we're getting from that single cow, it was contributing to 2% of our daily revenue. So it's quite beneficial when you basically touch on two aspects. First of all, relevancy index, that you get something very customized and very relevant to the consumer. Secondly, the time to market, as we call it in commercial, but it's time to respond to such act. Those were the two findings when we did that, and I just wanted to share with all.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear your reflections and experience, and then to talk about the research. And of course, you've had advanced sight of the research and how to look at it. So of some of the findings, the uses and barriers that were highlighted in Bor, South Sudan, were there any similarities for you in your market, in your country, in Sudan?
Yes, the unbanked. They were standing at 8% unbanked population in Bor, and it's quite similar. Maybe Sudan is slightly higher at 12%, but it's a similar percentage for having a very low populated area that having banking system. Interesting though, in the contrary, we do have a similar unbanked rate, but our mobile penetration for MFS is around 50%, where in Bor it's 6%. There's a huge difference between the two rates. Another interesting finding, I was talking earlier with you guys, the elderly for the reluctance of using the digital. And we noticed in Sudan that they do rely on youth, younger generation, to influence them in terms of becoming a digital savvy. And that's also happening in Sudan. So I found some similarities in terms of the unbanked and some of the behaviors when it comes to the digital, which was quite interesting.
Thank you. And in the research, we, of course, focused in 3 different contexts, but there are also thematic areas of focus in the research. 3 in particular, which is not all of them, but 3 in particular that we can talk about a bit today. Financial well-being, digital leisure, and misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And John, I know that digital leisure is something that you're very interested in, so maybe you could share a bit about what we have found and on that topic that we've focused on thematically in the research.
Thanks, Kimberly. And it's quite a nascent area of research, and maybe some might not be familiar with the term. So just to unpack what this really means, it's kind of coming to the standpoint where humanitarians or development organizations have traditionally come in with digital development, ICT for these sort of projects, all of them with a very utilitarian sort of focus. And actually to say, well, yes, those are obviously very important in terms of things like the Sustainable Development Goals, but there are a bunch of other things in there that contribute to individuals' well-being, satisfaction in life, and that includes leisure, entertainment, and more. And we'd seen consistently over a number of previous research projects that we've done with the GSMA that, you know, people were using mobile for these different purposes, but this time we decided to dig much deeper into that. I think for me, what was really compelling, and it links a bit to Hiba's remarks just there, was that, you know, we saw in South Sudan in particular that, yes, this was the case for very much for the younger people in the community, but elderly people weren't using mobiles as much for leisure purposes, and maybe that's something that needs to be looked at, because why should leisure only be for the young? I think everybody of any age has the ability to enjoy themselves using the digital technology around them, and that obviously maybe, you know, there are actions that could be taken to address that. I think one of the other things that really stood out for me within the framing of the research was that in many environments where, and this also beyond the countries in scope from our sort of own anecdotal research, is that where you have policy restrictions in terms of the right to work or freedom of movement, people often, in the fact that they're unable to do various things, will sink into sort of leisure spaces, whether that's social media, YouTube, or other avenues. And actually, there's a lot of things that can be done in these spaces to promote a healthier, safer environment in these spaces, that also then become opportunities for people to sort of express themselves, self-actualize, and you know, be themselves in digital spaces. So there were some really compelling points to me from the research around digital leisure.
And what do you think that means for humanitarians? I mean, you said that traditionally, you know, there's new considerations, obviously, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is sort of painting a picture of why we should look at these issues. Mm-hmm. You know, many donors might be saying, well, hang on a sec, why are we really doing this? We're not, you know, sort of delivering cash or getting things shipped out to people. And actually, I think what that means is, and this possibly requires some further research, is looking at how we can articulate what the impact of these interventions around digital leisure could be. And I would say it's more indirect than some of the direct impact that you might be seeing through various interventions, but we know, and this is relatively nascent, that things like community well-being, community resilience, are all affected. Even mental health and psychosocial support can be positively impacted by people being able to access digital leisure spaces, and warrants a case for humanitarians to be able to invest in those and do something about it. But I would say that it's very early days. We've got a bit more research to do. We're actually going to be releasing UNHCR some new research on this maybe early next year, building off the findings of this research that we've done with the GSMA. So we'd be happy to work with and collaborate any other actors working on these issues.
Great, thank you. So maybe to continue on that theme, Hiba, from your perspective and your customers, how important is leisure, entertainment, or some of these things that the research has looked at?
I would also refer to the example I just mentioned regarding the, when we have a perception about what is needed, and then suddenly it came out with a different result, that there are a huge need for leisure and entertainment. And that made us realize that conceptually we need to do more analysis, or more prompt regular analysis when we actually adhere to any need or any humanitarian actions. And we've noticed that it's not that far from the insight we've got from the research, but then we sliced down into the data, and we looked at majority of people who are in that displaced community. 50% of the usage they have is related to social media, in specific Facebook. 12% was related to streaming, could be TikTok, YouTube. 20% was contributing to things related to work or education, and that was quite significant. And 10% came out with live gaming, and it just there, and it calls you out to address such a need that pops out with more customization offer, with more customized communication. And one of the things I just remembered now, we had huge challenge with the language. Suddenly, when a displaced community comes in, you expect them to understand what you're talking about, but the language was a barrier for majority of them, because we couldn't just communicate in their own language. And those were all findings for us that make us think of leisure entertainment differently, address them as we go, and be relevant to the actual community that get displaced.
When we think about, so we dove in a little bit on that theme, and something else we really wanted to look at was financial inclusion more broadly. But we actually ended up finding quite a limited use in Bor in South Sudan, Sally, and you spoke a bit more about South Sudan, and also in IOR and PNG. where we looked at this. Can you tell us a bit more about those challenges?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kimberly. So we were quite fascinated to see how there was a very low uptake of mobile money and different financial services across Papua New Guinea and also in South Sudan, in Bor. We were really fascinated because we expected that it will be in such a humanitarian context, there will be high level of humanitarian cash assistance, since now it's growing across multiple countries, but there was not so much use cases in this sense across the two countries. So we wanted to understand a little bit why this is the case and what are the barriers for the communities to use that. And the biggest barrier for them was the inconsistent flow of funding, but also unexpected. So they can expect maybe once a year transfer, or a transfer every 3 days across the other seasons. And these represented the biggest driver. If they would have more consistent and expected flow of financial cash and different financial flows, they would have more driver for this service. We were also, surprised to see that there will couple of other challenges, including the digital literacy. So how communities use their mobile phones, how they be able to trust the mobile money operator to do these transfers, and how can they use that. We also came across a fascinating experience in Papua New Guinea where Save the Children was doing digital literacy trainings to the displaced communities, how they can use their mobile phones and how they would manage to use them in a good way as a step so they can launch their future financial money project. So that looked like a very good initial step for a future humanitarian programming and cash assistance. What was also very interesting to see is the demand and the appetite, the very big appetite for mobile money and different financial services across both contexts. So despite there is not much services going on, but most of the communities we talk to, they will say, oh, this would have saved me a lot of money and effort. This is indeed a need for us, especially with the displaced communities who would like to transfer the expenses or educational expenses to their children, as we saw particularly in Papua New Guinea. So that was something very interesting to see. We want also to highlight few things. As Hiba mentioned, we have only 6% in South Sudan in Bor that had mobile money accounts, and this decreased number or very limited number was expressed a lot of frustration among the communities. So they said that how far that would disable them from doing more and having more financial activities. One other barrier that was coming even more strongly in Papua New Guinea than in South Sudan was the trust. So many identified that how can they trust their mobile service operators and different banks and different digital services, financial services in doing that. So obviously there should be a lot of investment before launching these kind of interventions, especially with the communities. We were surprised to see that the language barrier was not much observed in either of the countries, in South Sudan or in Papua New Guinea. So it seems that there are better adaptability of the different financial providers for how they address and speak to the displaced communities. I think that there's here a quote that is fascinating by one of our members in South Sudan that I would like to read it for you. So he said, I agree that the majority don't use mobile money. I don't even know what mobile money looks like. I heard but never saw how one works. I think that the whole notion about hearing about something, but you hear that it exists, it can make your life easier, but you don't know what that is and how to use it, is something that many humanitarian organizations, I think, can identify as an opportunity to build, programs to introducing it to the affected communities, introducing this as a new service. I think that can benefit a lot. Also, I just wanted to highlight a few things about the level of maturity of mobile financial services and also the low levels of digital financial literacy. The combination of both the maturity in-country infrastructure for mobile services, but also this low levels of digital financial literacy both interact together to contribute to this low uptake and low usage.
Yeah, and I think just to have a quote and an anecdote, that's something that's a theme throughout the report. You know, really hearing from people, people's experiences, the inclusion of digital diaries, et cetera. And Hiba, does Sudatel engage in any humanitarian cash programming, or how do you see this as contributing to financial well-being of your customers?
Being a country with a population of 46% below the poverty line makes the cash programs an exciting tool and makes people happier, and yet it will actually contribute to the financial well-being. We in Sudatel, we have proper partnership with many of the cash programs, with the humanitarian organizations. For example, we have a program with WFP, we have UNDP, we have the International Committee of Red Cross. We also have the Sudan Family Support Program, and all of them are programs that are running. As I mentioned earlier, that the MFS in Sudani, and they have a higher rate of penetration, so there are lots of registered customers among our base. We look at around 5 million out of 9 million, so that's quite a quantified figure. And with those programs, we've managed to reach around 700,000 customers with the cash program, and that the total value of the given out cash were around $8.4 million, yet to grow. 700,000 is quite a shy number, but there were challenges with the cash programs. I think Sally touched base on them. We do have our cash availability issues. We have security issues in more of the distributed areas. We also have the awareness of the beneficiaries. How do you do cash out so you can benefit with the cash? We're still a nation that loves cash. That's why people cannot really relate to the digital money. Also, one of the most challenges we're facing is the identification. One of the mandatory for you to get a SIM card with the operator, it has to be registered under a national ID number. And that came across with the cash programs, that it was a barrier for them to get SIM cards because they don't have a national ID. So those are the running, and we're still running more programs to come when it comes to the cash. We've got 3 new programs on place coming up. And I think we do have the platform to do that. And cash make people happy, for sure.
Thank you. Just before we wrap up and we get some thoughts, closing thoughts from our panelists, I just want to dive in and ask one more question to Sally on one of the themes in the report, which is misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. So it emerged as a widespread concern where we conducted research, but it actually manifested quite differently. So just for our audience, misinformation is false information that is spread unintentionally. Disinformation is false information that is intentionally fabricated and shared with bad intent. And hate speech is all forms of print, audio, and visual content that is spread to incite hate or aggression or violence. So it was a theme that we looked at in the report. And Sally, if you could say a little bit more about that, and our audience can learn more about the different themes and contexts, but it'd be good to hear more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kimberly. So indeed, we were surprised to see very high prevalence of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech among both the displaced communities, but also their host community across the 3 contexts in Lebanon, Papua New Guinea, and South Sudan. But exactly as you mentioned, they were manifested differently. So the way that and the way that they were practiced, but also the type of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech were different across countries. But not only their type, the way they impacted the population and the way they impacted displaced communities in their day-to-day life, the way they are sure about their presence and what the future will hold to them, especially during the course of their displacement, they were also different among the 3 countries. for example, like the way they were in northern Lebanon, they were totally different from Papua New Guinea and in Sudan. So among the Syrian refugees and the Lebanese host communities, the most common form was hate speech. We could spot hate speech digitally across the different platforms, across the different online platforms, but also in the community, both among the Syrian refugees and the Lebanese host community in Tripoli and Akkar. So our study found that 62% of the communities that participated in the survey have been saw hate speech online. 62%. That's really huge number. Many highlighted during the interviews that many of the hate speech were directed towards the Syrian refugees, and how far their presence in the country would create additional burden to the already existing fragile context in Lebanon, particularly in the north that is already more vulnerable and face economic challenges and barriers among the host communities themselves. That was not really the case in Papua New Guinea, where the majority faced that the biggest concern were scams. All these messages and mobile text and text and Facebook and WhatsApp messages about scams that they receive in their mobile phones were the biggest concern. And before thinking about many of the messages, they think, is it a scam? So that's something that we found among the communities, how the scams were really a big concern for them and how they use their mobile phones. For example, how different communities use their mobile phones. The most common scam was the ones that are targeting, for example, people or Photoshop pictures of some people, and yeah, that puts a lot of communities at very awkward situation with their families and communities. So that was also something that was seen in Papua New Guinea, but not in the other context. When we talked to communities in South Sudan, in Bor, we found that the most common one was the false and fabricated news, particularly about the conflict, the peace-building situation, the kind of negotiation between the different political actors. There was every day some sort of fake news that were coming or misinformation that they would identify across the different platforms. It was also interesting to see what kind of sources the different communities trust, and in the particular context of South Sudan, it was fascinating how they rely on radios, but also rely on their community members for verifying if this information is true or is it misinformation or something that is incorrect. So it was also interesting to see a little bit emerging process for verifying what's correct in this context and what's not. However, the process for verifying if an information is true or not was different among the three countries, with the most developed process seen in Lebanon, where the communities developed a very sophisticated process that seemed complex. For example, they would go to the social media of this organization and see if this information, particularly around humanitarian assistance, is correct or not. They know what is a verified social media account once they see the blue sign of verification. They also have very close connections with the different community volunteers, many of the UNHCR team, so shout out to the colleagues in Lebanon as well. They have all these relations with the community volunteers, enables them to ask them if this information is correct, particularly around humanitarian assistance. But all these verification did not prevent communities from experiencing a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, particularly scams and humanitarian scams as well. So that's something that maybe we should invest more in, making the communities aware of how to reach out to the different humanitarian organizations and what are the channels that are available for them to verify a certain information, particularly in challenging times like the COVID-19. Yeah, I think one last thing that the communities were sharing, how they were also a little bit skeptical about how their information is shared, particularly with different organizations and different authorities that emerged more among the refugees rather than the IDPs. So that's also important to notice.
Thank you, Sally. I believe we are nearly out of time. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists if they want to share any final remark on the biggest takeaway or a reflection that you haven't yet had the chance to do. I'm not sure if we'll have time for a question or two. We might do. But let's just take a few closing remarks, and then we'll see if there are any hands up with any burning questions before we close. So John, maybe I'll go to you, and then to Sally, and then we'll finish with Hiba.
Thanks, Kimberly. I would say that my takeaway is sort of nuance. If we look sort of 5 to 10 years ago with these interventions in the digital and humanitarian space, it was often, in my perspective, a lot of blunt instruments that were sort of one size fits all, treating the community as homogenous. And what we've come to today, and I think it's in large part because of this research and also the digital lives of refugees, which was the report from, I think it was 2019 or 20, I can't remember, but these collections illustrate the need for nuance, both in terms of the communities that we look at, the need to take an intersectional approach to understand the different needs of different types of members of a community, whether forcibly displaced or host community, across age, gender diversity, with also then the diversity of use cases. And that needs to be then reflected in the programming. And we're not going to be using blunt instruments. We're going to be moving towards more user-centered approaches that are catered and curated really based on the true needs of communities. And through this type of research, we can really get that understanding and make positive change to our programming because of the insights that we've gathered from this.
Absolutely. Sally?
Thank you so much. I definitely echo John's point. And also I echo the title of this report, The Digital Worlds of the Refugees and Displaced Affected Communities. I think it's really crucial for all the humanitarian organizations to start focusing on also the digital space and the digital world of refugees rather than just designing interventions and humanitarian assistance for the ones who are in person, because they became an integral part of what refugees are and what they access and navigate. But not only that, new risks and new emerging risks came from out of this digital space, and I think we should work closely to spot these risks and promptly manage them in the correct way. I also echo the point that John mentioned about how different humanitarian organizations should build this approach to identify barriers for different communities, particularly those who are at higher vulnerability of being digitally excluded, such as women or people with digital literacy challenges, and also people living with disabilities. I think these are very important points we consider. Almost all the validation workshop and stakeholder workshops that we conducted across Lebanon, Papua New Guinea, and South Sudan highlighted the importance of building new partnerships with the different mobile network operators, being a key player in this process, and how their role in different regulations and different also repricing can impact how the communities use and upscale also their use to mobile technologies. One final remark is that the impact of digital leisure and the digital using mobile phones even for leisure can go ways beyond what's obvious. For example, how in Lebanon, almost 62% of the Syrian refugees said that using their mobile phones for leisure contributed to their skills building and digital skills building. So it can be a really promising roadmap for different and further support to the displaced communities. And I think definitely that would be an interesting area of further research.
Thank you, Sally. And what you said about the importance of partnership with MNOs is a great opportunity to give Hiba a final word for any remarks.
Well said, Sally. Well, I was very interested in the research. Maybe this is the first time we get, as a mobile operator, to look into such researches like that. And there are plenty of takeaways, but I'm just going to list them into two. First of the interesting part about the digital skill, that was very outlined, and it was very interesting to understand. Because when we look into running business as normal, we want people to use more internet, obviously, because it translates into profit and so on. Especially for profit organizations, they look into how to generate more money from consumers. But the digital skill aspect, that you're getting more users to use their mobile, and they start with the behavior of learning more about the mobile, that will get them into becoming more into leisure, and that will drive them more into become a financial included. It just the whole ecosystem, it just made sense. And I think with this part of research, it makes us as MNOs realize that there is a proper formula for that, and it's already there. And the ROI is there. So the promptness and the adherence is a must to do when things like that comes in hand. Last thing that I wanted to also mention, the way that the research has been done with the persona, where you basically, it's like a diary. So you ask the actual audience on the day what they do, and the final remark, how do you feel? How did that make you feel? And it just, at each transaction point in the day, you touch basing on the emotion of the consumer or the actual displaced community. And that was very inspiring. I think we don't look into things like that. And that was my takeaway, actually, from the research. And one of the reflections that I just wanted to close with, enabling a whole ecosystem for humanitarian act makes it very beneficial for all. And it got me thinking, why don't we create a free app that can touch on all displaced communities around? Because there are huge similarities in communities between them, and they all want the credible information, and they all want the self-development apps, and we can do that if we basically get the right people on board. And that's it. I'll finalize like that, but I'm very pleased with the research, and it actually inspired me a lot as an MNO. Thank you.
Thank you, Hiba. I believe we're out of time and we need to wrap up. We also, and I'll look around for hands if there's any one question that anybody would like answered. Okay, we have one question I see on the aisle, and then we'll wrap up after that. And just to say, as Zoe's bringing the microphone, our panelists will be here after to ask questions, and we're also really fortunate to have Zoe and Linda and Mashin, who all worked on this research. They're here in the room, and they'll be at the back of the room. We have panels that have information about the research. There are QR codes to be able to listen to audio of people's experiences and download the report. So we don't have to finish here. You'll have more opportunity to talk to the experts. Go ahead.
Great. First of all, thank you very much for sharing the research. It's a very important piece of research. My name is Diane, and I work with the Global Disability Innovation Hub, which really looks to increase access to assistive technology for persons with disabilities. And we view mobile as an assistive technology. And so, John, I was very interested in you talking about the different segments that you looked at of the population. And I wondered if you could just maybe share 2 insights in terms of persons with disabilities in humanitarian settings, and maybe around usage or need, or whether it helped them to access assistive products that they needed to replace that they had left behind, and so forth. Thank you.
Thanks, and good to see you. I think it was 3 years ago I was speaking with a colleague of yours actually at Mobile 360 Africa, Bernard Shearer, about these types of issues. And it's a really critical piece, and there was some research done by the GSMA with communities in Nairobi a couple of years ago that looked into the specific needs of people with disabilities in the mobile digital space, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in this issue to pick up on that. I think what I've seen from some of not only the findings of this research but other projects is that there are some components, obviously, that link to the type of humanitarian service provision that may be important to take into account. Often you may see humanitarian organizations pursuing contact centers, helplines, obviously, for those with certain types of communication disabilities, such as the hearing impaired. Those sorts of solutions need to be adapted and modified to be accommodating and inclusive. And then in other cases, there is a big gap, I think, between, we talked about digital skills, and this is actually something that wouldn't require as much investment as other things, but in the ways that modern smartphones can actually be utilized with the accessibility features that are there, and also third-party applications to make full use of that. So I think that there are digital skills building programs that could be undertaken to address that. One final thing, I think, for me, which is important is, and we know this from some research that we did as UNHCR looking at the digital risks. That was also something we touched upon in this research, but that people with disabilities often face unique types of risks in navigating in digital spaces, in particular the sort of intersect between the real world and the digital world, where they maybe rely on trusted partners or primary caregivers to accommodate them in terms of helping them access digital. And this can sometimes come with risks in terms of being able to top up their device or charge their device safely. So I think those are things that humanitarians would also need to look at.
Great. Thank you very much for your question. I think that we have run over time, and so I think that we have to close. But thank you all for joining us. And as I mentioned, at the back of the room, we have big cutouts or things blown up from different focus areas of the research. You can scan QR codes to hear audio clips, to download the report. And the panelists are available, and Zoe and Mashin and Linda also who have worked on the project. We'd like to thank the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, who have supported GSMA's humanitarian purpose for 10 years now, and as I mentioned, who we're continuing to partner with. And thank you very much for joining us. Have a good rest of your week in Kigali.